You do for one. One of them's going to be, well, you don't know. I will. I'll need it.
Spanish speaking.
I'm not, yes, he's Spanish speaker.
Spanish or French? Or
Hello, yes. Yeah.
better to hear.
Jorge is speaking Spanish, yeah.
Okay, so we might get going for the sixth session of today. So we're making progress through our big day. And I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Ben Vickers, who's the Land Use, Forest and Ecosystem Sector Senior Specialist at the Green Climate Fund. And he has a 1-hour session talking about transforming, growing and restoring. What support will it take? Thanks, Ben.
Thank you very much, Lyndall, and welcome to session 6 of this investment forum. I will very briefly introduce what we're going to talk about here. Indeed, Lyndall, as you said, transforming, growing and restoring, what support will it take? This session will be mainly about the needs of forest investors, particularly in terms of information about forests, about the parameters that affect decisions that investors will make. And with us on the panel, we have 5 very highly qualified and a varied set of experiences. Online, who will join us, I think, later, we will have Mr. Marcelo Gomez de Silva Pereira, who is the Sustainability Manager from Suzano Incorporated. We have also joining us online Mr. Jorge Mario Rodriguez Zuniga, who is from the National Fund for Forest Funding in Costa Rica, that's FONAFIFO. Here with us in the flesh, we have Mr. Eduardo Rojas Briales, the chair of the Program for Endorsement of Forest Certification, PEFC. We have Mr. Kim Carstensen, the CEO of the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC. And we have Ms. Susie Schuford, who's the Portfolio Manager of Business Development in FMO from the Netherlands Government Investment Agency. So I think, as with previous sessions, what we're going to try and do is have some individual interventions and then come back to a moderated Q&A. And please, if there's any interventions from the floor or any online, when we get to the Q&A session, please raise your hand and someone, if I don't notice you, someone will draw my attention to you. So without any further ado, can I ask our first intervention from Eduardo, please? And I think you have a PowerPoint, which will come up.
Thank you. Does it work, the micro? Thank you, Ben, and the organizers for inviting me and the organizations I might represent to this important Congress, which is a pleasure to attend and to address. When we analyze possible external funding, we have basically 2 entrances. Next slide, please. Which is, on one hand, the funding objective. Are we speaking about establishing new forests, or are we speaking about working on existing forests? These are totally different frame conditions. And the source could be internal to the sector or external to the sector, and this also affects. And this provides, at the end, 4 different options. Next one, please. So if we focus on the forest-related funding, that we know, of course, in much more detail after many decades of work with the wood and other products industry, it is basically oriented to the industrial production, be wood or non-wood forest products that can be processed. Basically here the issue would be to overcome the existing bottlenecks around tenure, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, the accessibility to non-wood forest resources and the way to exclude other users, the finance, capacity buildings. It is also an important issue how we can work around increase the performance above legality and the resource available, how this quotient is like, how these resources are available, how they are conditioned, how they shall be implemented. There are many resources that have to be implemented through third parties, and this may also be a conditioning element. If there are jurisdictional approaches possible, that include all the players or not, if there are bases for these jurisdictional approaches that may allow to work on sustainability on a higher level than the smaller states that are very expensive to prove that sustainability in the whatever mechanism. It is very important in this concern as through bioeconomy, new potential uses of wood and bamboo are coming up fast, and many industries, in order to establish, require important funding from banks, and frequently these banks request them to have a secure supply, in difference to the established actors in the sector that have that correspondent track. It is important to ensure correspondent outgrower schemes of supply. This has the other risk, on the other hand, that is a single product orientation and generate a more monotone forestry. And of course, the legal basis for outgrower schemes. And in general, in this area, there is no further request for certification. In non-forest related funding, it's important to ensure that there are reasonable legal frameworks for them, that there are no important difficulties to anchor that, and they are consistent, the correspondent taxation frames, as it happens, the resources and the forests are on different hands. Here, the tenure of environmental services is an important pending issue. Unfortunately, when there was a big advancing in tenure internationally with the voluntary guidelines on responsible tenure of land, forest and fisheries in 2012, environmental services were excluded. And in this moment, it is very, very fluent how you define who is at the end the one that has the tenure, the responsibilities, and so on of environmental services. These are the governments, are the owners, are the managers, or whoever. And of course, there is this for non-forest rated funding will request above standard level on environmental and social performance. This would require, of course, a plus certification than the conventional certification. It would also require, especially if we are able to move into more jurisdictional approaches, that a comprehensive first assessment is done in order to compare the later process, because otherwise, when we later argue we have been proving or we have going backwards, if this has not been measured in the first assessment, we are out. It's also important that we avoid that all the funding is just based on carbon, and this would create also a bias as a just financed by wood forestry has as well, without considering soil and water biodiversity, resilience, heritage, or livelihoods. And it's important also as well to ensure that there are some professional responsibility that ensures the expected carbon sequestration for new forests, not that we have a pushback and what is expected to be sequestered in 30 years doesn't happen. Next one, please. When you focus on new forests, this is an easier case as carbon, the Climate Change Convention has created a very clear case. It's much clearer than the case of existing forests. The clear tenure is, of course, also a requisite. You need a certain legal basis regarding the carbon tenure for that. It's important to engage insurances. So in the case, especially forest fires or any other reason, you lose the forest, there is not a leakage in this case. It's important to take into consideration the taxation of all that, including the time dimension. Taxation administration normally don't understand forest timings. And it's important also that countries have really sufficient genetic resource policies and capacity and seed banks to supply the corresponding amount of seeds that all this planting will request, and not again bring seeds from other places that are not adapted to the area and are not general diversity. You need important vocational foresters training. Many countries that want to have big, massive afforestation don't lack of that, and this cannot be imported. They need also full coverage of area by forest rangers. All the countries that have planted in the past significantly, like Korea, had that. And of course, as efficient forest firefighting and forest health capacities in many areas, the lack of forest is due to repeated burning. And of course, you need to align important public resources, especially aligning with international financial institutions. It's very inspiring what yesterday the representative of the Green Climate Fund commented of the importance for them of forest investment. And it has to be complemented with services that build up capacity building and training and associations and cooperatives. Next one. In existing forest, voluntary markets are very small of the range per ton of CO2. despite there are lots of commitments, this is a more difficult issue. The high legal standards that exist may become a threat as they impede further development. And in the jurisdictional approach, again, is very important in order to ensure a mid-long-term partnership with a given area of one or a group of donors. And just coming to the conclusions, next slide. As I commented, in several cases, jurisdictional approaches might reduce the cost and allow to combine tendering of existing forests while establishing new ones. So both options in degraded areas are avoiding the risk of fire and pest expansion if we just concentrate on planting, because this is easy under the Climate Change Convention. The prices of a ton CO2 are more reasonable. But then if we forget the existing forest, then at the end, fire and pests could expand it. There is a great case of assisted natural regeneration, and in this moment, the frame of the convention is very negative, because if you don't plant, it is not recognized, and it is absurd to take the trees that come naturally, that are much more genodiverse and species diverse, and then plant them in order to get the recognition on the convention. This is really an absurd bias. It's true that while focusing on new forests may deal more market attraction, there's also the risk that big-scale afforestation that we've seen in the past have the risk to overrun local society and create label and very even-age structures that are on the long term not ideal. It's important to optimize the land use for food, biomass, and environmental service in a world that would sustain 10 billion people in the future. So it's important also to consider the need, especially for food. Agroforestry and silvopastoral system should be a pillar, and need the integration of local people, so are not adapted for massive, big afforestations. And we have always to think that planting is a valuable tool, is an instrument, but never an aim by itself. And in cost, carbon and rural livelihoods terms, it is more efficient to stop forest loss and degradation and to shift to sustainable forest management than planting vast areas that are at the end very expensive, and in some cases we don't know how really good they will be ensured. So basically, these were the 6 or 7 conclusions, and I look forward now for the discussions with the colleagues in the.
Thank you very much indeed, Eduardo. So essentially, I think one of the points we're making here is that we need, when we're talking about information needs and support needs for forestry investment, there is a clear difference between what is required in terms of new forests, in terms of investment in existing forests, and what we're ultimately the solutions that we should look for are those that allow for the combination of new and existing forests in a landscape, in a larger landscape. Jurisdictional approaches help us reduce costs and help us to tailor the information and support needs more appropriately. Now, for the next intervention, I think Kim, please.
Thank you, Ben, and it may be a relief to you. I do not have a PowerPoint. Very sorry about that, but I thought I would rather talk than show you pictures. I mean, the question I'll be seeking to answer is, does certification provide benefit in terms of being a tool that can direct and engage investment? My short answer would be yes, but my long answer is probably a little bit more important. First of all, I think it's important, at least for us as FSC, that the tradition we come from is one of setting standards. Setting standards is what we have done traditionally and through history. We are a multi-stakeholder setup where we convene stakeholders around setting standards for what is responsible forest management. How can you understand a forest as being responsibly managed with the environmental and the social and the economic requirement that it takes? That has a value. It has a value in terms of creating credibility because the stakeholders are on board with this approach to responsible forest management. This has a value for investors, and we see that happening in many cases already, in the sense that very many plantations that get established around the world actually already use certification, at least FSC certification, as the way that they can sort of document and verify that the forest management is of a quality where you can feel sure that these trees are also going to be there, or at least the next generation of these trees is also going to be there in the future. So in that sense, it works. Is that good enough? No, because it doesn't work in all cases. Where it doesn't work includes, for instance, the situation of smallholders and communities who are managing forests. We see far too few of them benefiting from investment. We also see far too few of them being certified. And that, I think, is a major challenge going forward. That's one. The second big challenge is that what happens in situations where the target of the investment is no longer timber production, or not completely timber production, but other objectives, such as the carbon in the forest. That is a market already. In the future, we do expect that the biodiversity in the forest will also become a market, and we also expect that the water that is protected by the forest will also have a value. What about these? Is certification, as it is currently understood, a tool for these investments? Well, probably not to the extent it could happen. So this is some of the issues that, or these are some of the issues that we're trying to work to resolve as best we can. The major thing here, I believe, is that we and the investors have historically not spoken very much with each other. And we have therefore not understood each other. We have had different vocabularies, different values, different engagement tactics, and we have not benefited from actually being able to deliver to each other what is needed. We have not delivered the tools that are important for investors, at least not in all cases, and they have also not delivered the money because they didn't get the tools that they needed. So that is what we are currently working on. For smallholders, what that means is to find ways in which smallholders can be empowered to actually get an easier way to become certified. That implies, for instance, we have a new procedure that has just been approved on continuous improvement, so you don't need to meet all the requirements in year one. You can actually have a gradual development of getting to meet the requirements. We have a new smallholder standard being rolled out in 4 countries in Asia, very important, we believe, and there's a lot of potential there. We're working a lot with indigenous peoples through an Indigenous Peoples Foundation to understand what are their needs, because they're not very much related to timber production. They're related to all sorts of other things that have value in the forest. So that's one. The second thing is about how do we make sure that the other values of the forest that are important for investors, and increasingly so, that they are also, you could say, covered and useful in the certification context. We don't want to become a certification scheme for carbon. We don't think that's valuable because there are already those out there that fit that niche. So we have made a collaboration agreement with Verra, and they will now be able to link this with FSC certification so that you can get FSC and Verra at the same time if it's the carbon credits that you're interested in. We also developed what we call an ecosystem services procedure, looking directly and explicitly at the ecosystem value that you get from managing your forest. Still, that is not the complete picture. We need to improve the ecosystem services procedure so that it speaks directly to the market and to the investors. At the moment, it doesn't yet do that. That is something that will happen over the next couple of years, and I believe that could be a major breakthrough in making this system relevant to the investors who want to have some kind of certainty that the places they invest in will actually grow forest, stay forest, and therefore also maintain and retain the values that is important in those areas. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Kim. So again, some key points I think you highlighted were that, yes, certification standard setting is not something new, but in the forestry sector, perhaps what is missing is the dialogue between the standard systems such as FSC, maybe also PEFC, and investors. So understanding what these investors need, development of new tools you mentioned to recognize environmental and social services, to recognize the need for incremental progress towards more sustainable management, particularly with smallholders and indigenous peoples. So there's movement towards understanding what investors require in terms of information and standards, and also progress, we believe, from the investor side needed in order to adapt these tools and standard systems to allow the investment to flow. So I will hand over now to Susie, and you have a PowerPoint, I believe.
I have some pictures.
Some pictures, fantastic.
Yeah, I thought maybe a crash course in blended finance would be a good place to start. A lot of people are talking about how blended finance can potentially play a role. And one of the messages we've heard this week is that there's no silver bullet for investing in forestry. We believe at FMO that blended finance could potentially play a large role in mobilizing these types of investments. As a DFI, or development finance institution, we blend public and private funding. We use the higher risk appetite of governments such as the European Commission, the Green Climate Fund, the UK government, to invest in people and places where it's needed the most. And we give others, such as commercial and institutional investors, the chance to follow us when the first hurdles are overcome to taking these investments. This is because we don't only provide finance, we also provide capacity building, access to networks and expertise, access to risk capital. We also work with NGOs and key knowledge partners, such as those seated here and those in the room, to strengthen the business case around E&S, governance, and also impact. And this way, we hope that we provide the stamp of approval to these investments that give some comfort to commercial and private investors that these projects adhere to strong ESG and E&S principles. Next slide, please. So why do we need blended finance? Well, investors have they need a very high risk appetite to invest in forestry, and in particular in developing countries. I think many of us know why this is, or many of you can think of a few reasons, and there's a myriad of reasons for this, many of them stemming from environmental, social, and governance risks, also political risks, reputational risks. And this is also combined with or compounded by the types of investments we're speaking of. These are long-term investments, they require long time horizons, and the cash flows are often delayed for up to 10, 15, even 20 years. So designing a blended finance program means that we need to de-risk or take away some of those hurdles. Next slide, please. So blending may sound easy enough. In practice, it's actually very difficult to get the structure right. It requires a deep understanding of the finance and also the local context. That's why working with local partners is key. But what does it actually entail? I'm sure many of you always wonder when you hear blended finance, what does this actually mean? So we as a DFI, we sit in between the public and the private sector. We take public funding and provide it in the form of concessionary capital. We do this in the form of low interest or long tenor loans, lines of credits to banks. We also take equity stakes in companies and in funds. We also provide risk mitigants and first loss capital, such as guarantees that we take from the European Commission. There actually is a current call for proposals from the European Commission called EFSD+. They're hoping to channel billions of dollars in guarantees to DFIs and others to de-risk these perceived risky investments. And in cash flow terms, this structure, it regulates the waterfall to investors in a certain way that allows private investors some of the benefit on the back end of the cash flows. Essentially, we are allocating risks to the public and private parties that are best equipped to take on that level of risk. Next slide, please. And most blended finance includes technical assistance and grants. And again, I think everybody at this conference should work closely and does work closely to accomplish this. And why? Because these projects are often not yet investable ready. We need to build a pipeline of investment ready projects, and we also need to address potential risks extremely early in the process Again, mainly E&S risks, but also a myriad of other risks. And we do this often in partnership with local NGOs and CSOs and local consultants and others to overcome these investment risks. In the case of a forestry project, this support usually expands the ESG capabilities. It improves the impact and financial performance, but also we help investees to think and improve their approach to certification schemes such as FSC, also how they're going to approach the many pitfalls to carbon. We've heard a lot of people being very enthusiastic about carbon, but there are many pitfalls to engaging in the carbon markets. You have supply and demand side integrity. You also have the question of additionality, double counting. All of these are very complex questions and require a lot of expertise. Many of our investees don't yet fully understand how to undertake these investments, and so we hope and we do provide expertise to support them on this pathway. An example of this is our Mobilizing Finance for Forests program. It's funded by the UK government. And there we have a dedicated equity and grant facility, and alongside we have a repayable grant and TA facility where we provide support in the form of consultants, but also in grants that help to de-risk many of these investments. Next slide. And in sum, we feel that the right blend improves the risk-reward profile of investing in forestry. And in doing so, we can mobilize the level of private capital needed to really reach transformational change for the sector. Taking one of our GCF investments as an example, $100 million provided by the GCF enabled us at FMO and our partners to mobilize $800 million in private and institutional investment. Also, our UK-funded program, which I mentioned, Mobilizing Finance for Forests, we received £150 million from the UK government. We expect to mobilize 3 times that amount in commercial and institutional investment. So I think together, working together jointly with all of the important organizations and entities here at this conference, we can overcome these risks, and I hope mobilize the amount of financing needed to reach the SDGs, but most importantly, to invest in forestry. So thank you very much, Ben and everyone else on the panel.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Susie. So I think what we got there was a very quick blended finance 101. And yeah, the key takeaways that what blended finance and what FMOs and government investment agencies essentially allow us to do is to use this high-risk appetite from the government sector to go where private finance can't go, but set a path so that private finance can follow later on. And it also essentially allocates risks in the investment in these high-risk environments between the public and private sector, according to the suitability of those risks to public or private investors. It also has the opportunity to use grants as well as investment in order to build the environment where private investors can then come in terms of providing information or providing training to the actors required to support the forestry sector, building information and capacity on certification, knowledge about supply and demand, knowledge about ESG metrics, and the potential, Susie, as you mentioned, has been demonstrated through your experience in terms of leveraging 3 times or more private finance as a result of a public investment from GCF, UK government, etc. So thanks very much for that. I think we're now going online where we have Jorge, I think, first from FONAFIFO waiting for us. And Jorge will speak in Spanish, so please have your earpieces ready. Jorge. Is he there?
Sí, muy bien. ¿Me escuchan? ¿Me escuchan?
Yes, we can hear you.
Ok, muy bien. Bueno, muy buenos días, tardes.
It is great to be here from Costa Rica. I am saying hello to everyone, and it is great to see everyone here today. Currently, regarding the situation in Costa Rica, In particular, regarding forestry investment, I would like to update you on the situation. Regarding forest investment, when we think about the topic, I think that we need to have a long-term perspective. In particular, for countries like Costa Rica, we have the smallholders, and the smallholders are facing many difficulties. And let us go to the next page. Let us look at the Costa Rican situation, and you can see the size of Costa Rica area. You can see about 5.11 million hectares, and you can see 2.67 million hectares is the wooded areas, the forest areas. In Costa Rica, you can see there are many companies in forestry, and forest utilization is contributing greatly to the national economy. As of 2013, you can see 58% took up the forested areas, and you can see currently the percentage has gone down a bit. So let us move on to the next page. In Costa Rica, there are several things that you must know and what is important. The ecosystem or a forest and their definitions, I believe, have significance. Looking at the UN Climate Change Convention, when we look at the definition of forests, it actually has a bit of a different definition compared to what is defined in the Costa Rican Act in forests. And according to Article 75 of our Forestry Act, you can see according to UN convention, it is 52% the amount of the forest. So you can see actually the definition will change the area of forests. Next page, you can see the different types of land titlement or tenure in Costa Rica, and you can see the legal backing is in the Costa Rican law, and you can see about 93,000 farms are in Costa Rica, and among them we have smallholders or small farms. 1 to 20 hectares is about 78% of the total, so it takes up a great percentage of the total farms. And you can see that in Costa Rica, we have smallholders that take up most of the forestry. As was mentioned, for these smallholders, they are the backbone of our forestry, and we have many companies related to forestry, and there are about 8,000. Regarding the forestry utilization and the paper making industry, we need to protect them and we need to support them. We need appropriate legal framework and support, and if not, it will be very difficult for them to survive. In most cases, environmental protection is important, but in many cases, they are not utilizing the land properly. Also, in forest restoration, we are also seeing that many are left to be desired. we need to think about how to restore this, and we need to think about how to support this. If not, then it will lead to economic crisis, and it will lead to many economic difficulties. This also can lead to many difficulties, including deforestation. Well, if we go to the next page, can you hear me well?
Okay.
Okay, okay, la siguiente.
Would you go to the next page? I think my page is frozen. And although I can't see the slide myself, but I will just continue. So this is the vision that we have. There are many nature ecosystem services that need to be resumed, and we need to upgrade our awareness of forest environment. And for the forest environmental services, we need to provide legal and social support. So this will be needed. Regarding the environmental services, as was mentioned, we need to have better awareness and recognition of what this is. And in the case of Costa Rica, we have many important economic activities in forestry, including tourism. And most of our visitors are visiting protected areas. So Costa Rica is well known as a green tourism country, and we need to maintain this. And our next vision is to find new ways to attract investment. We also need to revitalize our economy, and this needs to lead to green jobs. Africa, Asia, and Latin American countries need to cooperate with us so that we can have sustainable forest maintenance, because I think we're all facing challenges going forward. I believe that we also need to have ties between forestry and, for example, agriculture. We need to support the smallholders and small-scale farmers as well. As was mentioned, we need to attract new venues of investment and secure investment. To this end, we will create green jobs and revitalize our economy. And as was mentioned, we have many smallholders, and I believe that we need to have them integrated into different units so that they can be better managed. In addition, in managing this type of small forest, we need to review our standards, and we need to have an efficient financial support mechanism, and we need to connect this together. In particular, I believe that this needs to be focused more on our smallholders, and I believe that these investments need to create efficiency. Regarding the accreditation of land title holders and national heritage, or we need to also think about what is needed in the area of investment in forests. There are many cases when, because of legal reasons or because of land title reasons, the investments are not made. Regarding the land titles, if they're not accredited and if they are not clear legally, in many cases, investment cannot be secured. Accordingly, I believe that we need to have a framework so that this type of support can be given. So we will need to have more improvement in these areas. Around the world, we need to remember that most of the forests are managed by the indigenous people. I hope that all of these factors can be considered so that we can safeguard and protect our forests. I believe that many countries share similar challenges like Costa Rica. And as was aforementioned, these are very important resources of our countries. So we need to protect them and to have financial frameworks and to connect them to different mechanisms. Thank you for listening. And I will end my presentation on this note. And please ask me any questions if you would like. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Jorge. And so just briefly, I think Jorge was giving us a presentation of the Costa Rica situation as an example, which many other countries might find relevant, of the changing nature of forest investment, and in particular, he referred to how the context of UNFCCC, we have to look at the changing definitions of forests, perhaps an incompatibility between international definitions and national definitions. In order to make sustainable investments, we need to have data on land holdings, looking particularly at smallholders. And when we're looking at the investment into forest-related industries, paper and timber, for example, if we don't have the right information about landholding, smallholders, tenure, we cannot direct the right support towards forest stakeholders, and we risk economic difficulties. The recommendation from Jorge is that investment in future needs to focus on creation of green jobs, integration of smallholders, review of standards, development of financial support mechanisms for smallholders, clarity on land tenure in order to target investment in forest and support to the right areas and create efficiency in investment policy. So finally, we have one more panelist, and I think we are a little bit over time, but hopefully we still have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. So Marcelo, are you there and available with your PowerPoint? I think Marcelo will present in English.
Oh, can you hear me?
Perfectly. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Well, first of all, I would like to thank FAO for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and it's an honor to represent Suzano in this event. I would like to start emphasizing that the forestry business model in Brazil is one of the best investment opportunities for purpose-driven investors. And why am I saying this with such certainty? Well, let's look at some numbers from the Brazilian planted tree sector. In the next slide, please. Forest companies have 9.5 million hectares of planted forest, mainly from eucalyptus and pine. And these same companies are responsible for the protection and conservation of 6 million hectares of native vegetation in different Brazilian biomes. This area is larger than the entire country of Denmark, for example. And this number also means that for each 1.5 hectare of planted forest, we protect 1 hectare of native vegetation. This sector is one of the industry that preserves the most in Brazil. And we do it while being a global reference for plantation productivity and with high annual production volumes of wood per area in a short cycle. Please, the next slide. As a representative of the sector, Suzano is a highly competitive company with operations and a product pipeline that addresses several urgent global challenges, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, conservation of natural forests, and replacement of fossil fuels. In this slide, we can see the Suzano's value chain and some big numbers. We have 1.5 million hectares of eucalyptus planted forest, and also 960,000 hectares of native ecosystem areas. And our business model is not only about planting an eucalyptus forest. When we expand into a new site, we consider a landscape approach. And what does it mean? It means that it's not only the planted forest, but also the restoration of the native ecosystem when it's necessary, the social development of neighboring communities, and the biodiversity conservation and improvement through our monitoring and management programs. And these elements are not a part of the business, but an integral part of it. In summary, our way of doing things connects in an inseparable way social development, proper environmental management, climate change mitigation, and of course, business competitiveness. And this is intrinsic to who we are as a company and not something randomly done. And since Suzano is constantly looking for ways of going the extra mile, in 2020, we established 14 high-level commitments to renew life. And some of them use it as targets in financial operations, bonds and loans, for example. And 3 of these commitments I would like to highlight here with you all. Please, the next slide. Regarding the climate crisis, our goal until 2030 is the net removal of 40 million tons of carbon in the atmosphere. In the area of social development, our programs intend to take 200,000 people out of the poverty line in our areas of operation. And last but not least, our long-term goal related to biodiversity, one of my favorite ones. Consider that one of the greatest current threats to the biodiversity loss is the fragmentation of native habitats. We proposed to connect 500,000 hectares of priority areas for conservation of biodiversity in 3 Brazilian biomes, the Atlantic forest, the Cerrado, that is the Brazilian savanna, and the Amazon. Please, the next slide. And what is next? Well, to make all this a reality and to help define the good from the bad apples, the next crucial step for companies and investors is the development of tools that can really identify the business that have consistent, sustainable initiatives from those that are just riding the ESG wave. These frameworks must make the value generated by sustainability tangible and comparable on the same basis and with science and for all. I mean real value, which can be verified and measured using indicators, targets, history, and so on. And real contributions to the resolution of social and environmental challenges, which must differentiate companies from one another. Otherwise, we may never be able to realize the potential and benefits of sustainable investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcelo. I mean, that's going to help us keep the time, but I think you made some valuable points in here. And particularly, just to summarize, Suzano is an example of a company that commits to social and biodiversity benefits as part of its business model through a landscape approach, and in particular, long-term goals in becoming more climate positive, so contributing more to climate change mitigation, mitigating income distribution problems, working with 200,000 disadvantaged families, and biodiversity conservation goals through connectivity and corridors in 500,000 hectares across 3 biomes. And what Marcelo was stressing was that for companies like this, which are making these commitments, we need ways for investors to identify such businesses that are generating these values for sustainability and recognize that value in the marketplace. So that brings us to the end of our individual interventions. We are now quite close to time, but we have a few minutes, and so I'd like to just delve into a little bit of a discussion, if we can, through a few questions, and we'll get a few short and insightful answers from our panelists. So first of all, can I ask you, Susie, how has the climate crisis affected the information needs of investors in forest-based industries in terms of the type of information they need, the sources they trust, and the standards of due diligence they require?
Yeah, so
Mike.
yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah. Is it better? Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so we as an investor, we've seen that our due diligence requirements they've grown much more stringent and much more complex. There are a lot more data requirements now than ever before, and that's primarily because we want to mobilize investments towards commercial investors, and they are extremely concerned about reputational risks. They want to achieve impact, and for that, we all need a lot of good quality data. So it used to be, 10 years ago, IFC performance standards were sort of the gold standard. Now we see IFC performance standards plus, meaning you need to look at a whole myriad of other factors, including, biodiversity net gain frameworks, which there's not much data on how to properly manage biodiversity gains. Looking at how to monetize nature-based capital, it's also a completely new field. But investors want this type of data, and they want to move towards having a framework that is standardized for this type of data. Also, in terms of certification schemes, this is now pretty much a requirement, maybe not from the initial investment, but definitely our investees. As mentioned, we provide them a lot of support sitting between public and private. We want to move them towards private, so what we do is if they don't have FSC certification yet, we work with them to get it and to ensure that they're not just certified, but they're actually implementing it and monitoring it. And all the expertise they need in-house. It's not just having an E&S officer, you need a gender specialist now. There are a lot more requirements now than there ever were before. And this is definitely because of the climate crisis. And that does come with a lot of challenges, which is why I think we need to work even more closely together with specialists, such as everyone here. Unfortunately, we often don't work together very well because we speak different languages, which is what Carsten said. But yeah, I think that we definitely need to work better together and learn how to collaborate more effectively so that we can make use of this data and catalyze more of these investments. Because more requirements we have, we're actually somewhat preventing investments. What we want to do is ensure that we can mobilize investments, not limit them. So, yeah.
Thanks, Susie.
If that was clear.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay.
Does anyone else want to come in on this question briefly? Jorge? Was that a finger I saw? No, it wasn't. Okay. All right. Well, moving on. Kim, is there, in the context of certification, is the perfect the enemy of the good? If you were demonstrating compliance with international sustainable forest management standards, when this is beyond the capacity or resources of small and medium enterprises in emerging and frontier markets, how can we encourage and reward incremental improvements?
Well, we have a big dilemma here. On the one hand, we are absolutely needing to be able to document, to ensure that high standards are being upheld in any kind of operation. So we cannot just say, well, anything goes, because it doesn't, right? As Susie just said, there are enormous amounts of different requirements that need to come up. Some of them not even part of our standards at this point in time. And so it's getting more and more complex. On the other hand, you're also right in the question, Ben, that we have not found the ways yet to actually make certification an easily accessible tool for smallholders and communities. And it is something we're working on. I think this continuous improvement procedure is going to help in the sense that we don't need everything to be met in the first go. It can be happening over time. I think there are some other ways to actually make life easier and more fitting with the reality of the smallholders. It's not just about meeting many requirements, it's about meeting requirements that don't make sense. And that's what the problem is, at least for communities, indigenous peoples and others, that they're asked to do things that don't make sense to them anyway because they do things differently. And that's one thing that we need to accommodate to. So on the one hand, absolutely yes, we need to simplify. On the other hand, we need to make sure that the basis is still so that we can document actual performance.
Thanks, Kim. Maybe Eduardo, the same question for you.
Well, it's true that it is a complex issue for everybody to move in this direction. And I think it's important to tackle what Tim said regarding smallholders, communities, the small players. And in fact, there is a risk that we, in certain way, we have seen it, and you have been working in RED Plus long time. At the end, the aim of RED Plus was that they are result-based payment, not that lots of white consultancy and organizations make the big money, which at the end is what the money has flowed until now, basically. It's not about paying the architects, it's about having the building built. So in that sense, we have to turn it the other way around. If it doesn't really ensure for these local communities a benefit, at the end, thanks to it reduces the pressure on the forest, we are not working in the right direction. So it's always important to check all kinds of theories and systems on how well they perform for their objectives. And in that sense, we have to think of different ways. It was very clear what Jorge said regarding tenure, which would be even of another octave if we would think of sub-Saharan Africa. We have double and triple tenure issues around, which is, and you have seen the last FRA, where South America, with all the problems, have moved very good forward in the decade, whereas Africa has kept back. So that is also an important issue. And in that sense, that's why I insisted so much in jurisdictional approaches. The auditors, they have to be skilled, and I want not to criticize their cost, but it has really no sense. We are not measuring the quality of a single pen. We measure eventually in a big company every 100,000. We will measure, of course, an Airbus or Boeing, because there we fly and it is really risky. So we have to consider real smallholders as a pen, not as the system. And in that sense, do many, and I think it's also a very interesting issue, by focusing on jurisdictional approaches, many of the challenges of sustainability cannot be measured on 1 hectare or 2 or 5 hectares. They can be measured at the jurisdictional scale of a mountain massif, of a province, of a district, or whatever. And creating also a joint endeavor of all the players for sustainability will bring things much more further. Issues of forest fires, of pest fight, of accessibility cannot be solved on a very small scale. It's like a small forest owner at the end, or manager, is like if you live in an apartment, you're also co-owning the common elements. And constructing this common structure, I think, will bring us further in the substance, and will also put these costs of the auditors into a reasonable level. And we have also to think, regardless that we all want to have high level, it is an incremental issue. This forest didn't look in 1970 like they look now. They were all small trees. And and they have moved forward. So it's always that we never go back, except the issue is out of control, like climate change or whatever, or a big catastrophe, and that we always move forward. This is, I think, the basic issue in certification and in all this process as well of defining. And it's very important, like Susie said, that we have to fine-tune and come more together constituencies that traditionally have not worked together and understand each other. I think also it's very interesting what a colleague from Susano just commented, this model that even if under climate change is much more easy to understand offset afforestation from scratch, that 1990 we are no forest. Yes, but in certain way to avoid that we just see the land just as an opportunity to offset afforestation. That we get into say, yes, but if you wish this, you have to maintain at least a similar area of natural forest that is degraded, and you have to do some operations that are by far not as costly as afforestation. I think construction of that kind of thing will help not only to offset, but also to have this, in this case, the community, but also, of course, the environmental indicators and performance of the area.
Thank you, Eduardo. Just very quickly, last words to our friends online. Marcelo and then Jorge, quickly, do you think a global market in forest-related ecosystem services is a realistic aim in the next decade? Marcelo?
It's a good question, Ben. Yeah, I think it's quite challenging and complex, but I think we can accomplish it or something at least close to it. Because, for example, looking to the present, standing native forest with all the services that they provide to the society still has no assigned monetary value. And I think the most tangible resource that we currently have now is carbon, which is crucial to face the climate change and through a regulated market. And I think we should, or we could replicate that we are doing with carbon for other ecosystem service. For example, pollination. Here in Brazil, I was reading a study of the Brazilian Agricultural Research Agency, and 76% of the plant used to food production in Brazil depends on the ecosystem service of bees or the other insects or other animals. And water. It's obvious that water, people and business depend on the availability of clean water. And so these elements, water, biodiversity, pollination, they are not independent of each other. In ecology, everything is intrinsically connected. So if we don't have access to clean water, we don't have biodiversity, we will not have life, or we will not have business. So yeah, I think the future is to increase this kind of regenerative business. And I can see two ways for this question. One, of course, is in the question to create a market, and who protect and conserve the ecosystem is remunerated for that. And I think it's not a market that you would compensate some damage because any other area, because it doesn't make sense for this kind of ecosystem service, but in a way that you pay because you are receiving benefits from that conservation. That makes sense. And I think there are some successful experience. My colleague Jorge knows more than me about it in Costa Rica, and also in Brazil we have some experience that could be replicated and scaled. And the other way that I can see is the value of these ecosystem services coming to the business decision-making process and helping with science, methods, everybody to take better decisions. And I think this is a journey. We need a learning process to achieve that, and there are some efforts ongoing, but I do really believe that this is possible to achieve in this decade.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. We are, I believe, just gone over time. I'm sorry, but Jorge, if you have 30 seconds to give us your opinion, is this a realistic aim, a global market in forest-related ecosystem services in the next decade? Very quickly.
Sí. Cuando hablamos de recuperación verde, economías inclusivas, resilientes,
Regarding the preservation and restoration of forests, what we need to remember is that we do not have enough investment in this area. There are countries like Costa Rica, which is comprised of many smallholders, And when we have production and production input, and when we do not have financial regulations or support for them, then this can lead to challenges. In addition, we need to have sustainable management of these forests. And for the mill industry or paper industry to be productive, I believe that these smallholders need to be supported, and we would need to maintain the different expenses. There are many areas that need to be enforced, technical areas or financial areas that will need to be strengthened. In addition, we need to think about the smaller forests and what kind of added value can they generate. I believe that these will be very important. However, everyone, forests need to be sustainable, and this will contribute greatly to climate change.
Our panelists, thank you to everyone who joined us here in the room and online. And I think that's it for this session. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, panelists.